So first of all, thank you, Dean Lindenmayer, and thank all of you for coming this afternoon on such a we finally got a gorgeous spring afternoon. So we're going to get started, and I, first of all, want to say thank you for having me and allowing me to participate in this. I'm very, very excited for our conversation. I was telling Dr. Giesberg that I have been just devouring Last Seen for many reasons, and am really looking forward to getting to talk not only about the book, but also about choices and about her process. And so I thought that we could begin by just having you talk a little bit about how you came to this project and how you found all of these thousands of ads.
Sure. Everybody, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. I also want to thank everybody for being here. I know some of the students came just because I made them come, but everybody else who came, thank you for coming. And Dr. Lucky, thank you so much for being here with me. This is huge of you to take the time out of a busy semester to be here. I'm such a big fan of the work that you do, so I'm very thrilled to be here. And Bob, who I learned more from, more about history and more about writing from working with you on this book than I ever imagined that I would. I also wanted to underscore the point that Bob is also a history minor. I want to make sure I got that in there, just so that we set the record straight. So this book started as an archiving project that I began here at Villanova with my graduate students. As some in the audience will know, I have a couple of alumni in here of this project and then other projects. We identified, or we first ran into these advertisements in sitting in Falvey Library using the online databases for Black newspapers, and these ads, appeared when I was doing research on an earlier book. I started reading these ads and noticed that they were, what they seem to have great value for Black genealogists beyond, sort of the academic, scholarly kind of privileged position I was sitting in. Ads seemed to me to be, valuable to an audience way beyond the academy. So I enlisted the work of graduate students. Maggie was sitting right there, was one of the first generation to work on this project, and enlisted the collaboration of a friend of mine and a colleague of mine, Margaret Gerardo, who's an archivist at AME Mother Bethel Church. So we began to who had access to microfilmed versions of one of our newspapers that we were using. So we began to identify some of the advertisements, and we thought we would put them on an open access website so they would be freely available to the descendants of the people named in them, who might benefit from knowing more about their families and being able to fill in their family trees. So the project began modestly as an attempt to find a few hundred of these advertisements, we thought, and from one newspaper, and it grew from there to include now nearly 5,000 advertisements. We're more than 4,700 from over 300 Black newspapers, published all over the country, and the database is now regularly used by Black genealogy groups and individuals who are trying to trace their family history. So that's how the project began. It was until last week federally funded by the National Archives, but that funding has now ceased. So the future of the work is very much in question. So this is sort of, I put a pinpoint on what we've done up until now, because it's not entirely clear what we'll be able to do without the federal funding. So the National Archives has been kicking in money every year that pays for this work. So that was so that's the origin of the archive. And then speaking about the collection to Black genealogy groups across the region and across the country, they always ask one question, and that is, did the people named in these advertisements find their family members? And I never had a good answer for that. And the answer was always, I don't know. So what the origin of the book was then an attempt to try to answer that question, is if I could at least sort of trace 10 people's stories as far as I could based on the advertisement, and starting with the advertisement, and then finding out as much as I could find out about their search. Then I would at least have the answer to, I would be able to have an answer for 10 people.
Yeah.
So that's the origin of the book.
Yeah. So I want to talk some about the how you put this together, but I want to go back. This project also had a kind of theatrical life as well, and everybody might not know about it. So can you talk a little bit about that as well? And then I want to come back to the book.
Yes. So in 2017, a colleague of mine in theater, Valerie Joyce, I came to her and talked to, because she's interested in this period and this topic. And I had a conversation with Valerie, and what emerged from it was a performance that Valerie, directed and planned, where volunteers from throughout the region came in and chose an advertisement and read it out. And you were one of the volunteers, and others, and there were other people on campus who volunteered as well and read the ads in a very moving performance of the ads. And it's now, the website includes a lot of resources for teachers. So we've actually grabbed a few of the readings, and they're available. You can watch the whole performance if you want, but you can also watch select number of the ads being read by Villanova volunteers and volunteers from the community.
I have to say that was a real privilege to be a part of that and to be able to speak those words and to be in that space. I was a part of it. My husband was a part of it. There were young people, there were people from churches. It was really quite moving. And for us to give voice to those ads, so that they weren't just read, but that you heard the words, and it was really beautiful. I hope actually that you all will do that again. That you'll work with Valerie and do it again.
I would love that.
Yeah, I know it was a lot. It's a lot of work. It was a lot of work, but
and that's how the ads were supposed to be experienced. Right?
Yes,
they were supposed to be read out loud, right? And in churches.
Yes.
So it was a good way to sort of think about the experience of hearing these family stories read out loud.
Bob, can I bring you into this conversation? I would love to. Do you not have a microphone? Okay. I would love for you to talk a little bit about why you chose to buy Last Scene and how you and Judy came to work together on this project. And I have some follow-up questions, but I'd love for you to just sort of kind of join in when you joined this process.
Okay, so it began as most nonfiction books do begin, which was with a book proposal, a description of the book that came to me via Judy's literary agent, whom I knew and who knew me. I read the proposal, and I was immediately fascinated, because there is no other book like this book. We all know that families were sold apart during slavery, but what happened afterwards? I didn't know anything about that. That family members would be trying to find out about other family members for decades into the 20th century. That was an astonishing revelation to me. Nobody had told that story, nobody that I knew, certainly not for a general audience. There may have been a paper in a historical journal somewhere or something of that order, but a book on that subject for a general audience. And I was immediately interested in the book, and the fact that it came from a professor at a university like Villanova, which I happen to know quite well, and the research that Judy had obviously done already. So I wanted to publish that book. And the process at that point varies a little bit, but depending on how senior your position is in your company, and what kind of track record you have. You might be able to, as I was, go to the publisher right away and say, I want to buy this book. And then you go through a process of estimating what you think the book will sell, which is, that far removed from witchcraft, really. It's, we make estimates based on how other books on similar subjects, and of course there was no book quite like this, so we're talking about serious history from the mid-19th century that deals with slavery and the Emancipation era, and you sort of look at this and do some kind of legerdemain and come up with some numbers and all that, and we worked it out. So I bought the right to publish the book from Judy through her agent. But right from the beginning, I was sold on this book because it so clearly filled a need. It so clearly told a story that hadn't been told and should have been told.
Could you talk a little bit about how you all work together to, and I guess actually this is going to be a question, maybe it's a question for both of you, but as you say, there were thousands, right? And as this project grew, you came to learn about more and more stories. And I'm assuming that the archival project is happening at the same time that you're beginning to work on the book, right? So the amount of material is just blossoming and blossoming. How did the two of you work together to decide, what you were going to focus on and how you were going to focus on? I'm going to give you my mic so that both of you can talk.
Oh.
Here, you can have mine.
Okay.
Here.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are we going to talk
You
together
can have-
at the same time? You go first.
The author always goes first.
So when the proposal that I gave to Bob, I had an idea of sort of the most sort of representative or the kinds of the most common searches in the archive. So I had kind of an umbrella idea of who were the most common searchers and searchees, and so I wanted the chapters in the book to represent what the archive was telling us. So the most common searchers are mothers searching for their children. Either children were sold away or the mother was sold away. And then this, sort of equally most common was children looking for parents, and then siblings looking for one another. So and I won't go through all of them, but I had an idea of there were going to be 10 chapters in the book, 10 families, and they were going to represent the most common searches. I was also very determined not to. I also wanted it to be geographically diverse so that people could understand that this wasn't a regional phenomenon, that actually formerly enslaved people wound up everywhere. It wasn't. They didn't sort of wait till the Great Migration to start to move around the country. They were everywhere. Some stayed right where they became free. Others, went someplace else. But they were all searching. So I wanted it to represent sort of different places where people search. So those were sort of two criteria, and then I had like buckets and started to research people who fit those criteria, and also that I could find enough primary source material to tell their story with integrity.
Yes.
And then I also didn't want to choose. I wanted to be careful, and this is where I was going to turn it over to Bob. I wanted to be careful. The most common ads in the archive are those ads that are happy endings, and those are sort of different category. We have some in the archive, about 100 of them, that are a lot of them published in white newspapers that announce that freed people found one another, and those we've always treated like a separate category of thing. Although we know we know that doesn't represent all of the successful reunions, we wanted to make sure people understood they were sort of had a different goal in mind. And so when I was choosing the chapters, the subjects of the chapters, I wanted to be very careful that I wasn't sort of writing happy ending. Like I didn't want the chapters. I wanted to make sure I wasn't choosing people based on that kind of a narrative. I didn't, because I think that's a huge problem for reasons we can talk about. But,
yes,
yeah.
I was going to say, you guys can hear me, right? I want us to talk about that, right? Because I want to say, I don't know how many of you have read the book yet, or obviously I got an early copy, but I wanted the happy endings, right? It's human nature, right? We want to see people reunited, and we want a happy, we love a good story, right? A good ending. And you write really compellingly in the book about what the motives are often around the publication of some of these happy ending stories in white newspapers. So I would like to talk about that. Let's hold it for a second so that we can go exactly to what you were saying about Bob and the caution of which way to go and which ones to pick.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had determined, Judy had already determined early on that it's only 10 stories, and there are hundreds and hundreds of course, of these advertisements and so on. But you can't write a book about hundreds of these ads. Nobody would read it. You want to read about individual people and what happened to them, and it will only have meaning when you see how desperately a mother is looking for a child or vice versa. So we knew that it had to be, Judy knew from the beginning, that it had to be only a representative sample. And then it was a matter of making sure that it was representative. I suppose for 10, we probably slightly overrepresented the better endings, slightly, only because if you chose 10 stories and they all ended in failure, how depressing that would be to read. So, there had to be one or two stories in there where somebody succeeded. But it was really important to tell the stories. And the stories are all different, aside from the fact of whether it's a mother looking for a child or a husband looking for a wife. They're different because they tell different experiences. It was different in New York than it was in Mississippi. There were, the whole story of black newspapers was a revelation to me. I grew up with the Amsterdam News in New York, and to find out there were hundreds of black newspapers in the last part of the 19th century, I had no idea. And other stories in there were about the United States colored troops, the black soldiers in the Civil War. I mean, there were so many different stories, and yet Judy managed in 10 stories to tell a really wide range of experiences over this period of time. I mean, it was she knew the archives, she knew what would be representative, what wouldn't be. And, once we had, as I say, just enough happy endings so that readers didn't throw the book down in depression, and it was your book right from the beginning. I had very little to do with shaping it.
That's not exactly true.
Well, I kind of figured that, right? Go ahead. And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Just one thing, and that is to say that although I had the 10 stories in mind, what Bob had to remind me of repeatedly was that, was the creep, was that, that I wanted to say sort of one more example. I wanted to bring one more story in. And Bob was reminded me regularly that I needed to stay focused on. This wasn't like Sophie's Choice. It wasn't like I was like, it wasn't like giving somebody up, that there was a larger archive there, that people, that this was just the beginning, that there were other stories, that there would be other books written about these people, and so he was really good at reminding me of, not giving me 10, don't give us 10 examples of one thing, just sort of stick with the story. So.
And so I want to pick up on that because I wonder, Bob, from your perspective, was there a different sort of approach that you had to use editorially in working with this kind of a project, or would that have been more common in terms of your work as an editor, right? Does my question make sense? Like, is there something sort of unique about this kind of a project that made you shift your approach, or is this a kind of approach that you would have had with lots of different kinds of authors?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is in two parts.
Okay.
the way I work with authors doesn't vary dramatically from one book to another. But the specific way I work on a particular book definitely depends on that book. Some books are too long and need a lot of cutting. Some books don't. Every book's different. Every story's different. So you have to edit in a way that's particular to the manuscript you're dealing with. But the general process of how you work with an author doesn't really change that much from one book to another.
I do think that it's really important that you made the distinction also that this was not like a Sophie's Choice, right? I'm cutting something, I'm cutting someone's story, and no one's ever going to hear from it, or hear about that story again, right? Because you did have the archive, and the archive remains open access, right? And so I think I'd like us to talk a little bit about that as well, in addition to the loss of funding, thinking about open access and putting things behind paywalls, that kind of thing. Could you talk a little bit more about, so sort of two questions, and you can answer this however you want. One, I would like you to talk about those happy endings and the white newspapers and what the motive was behind that. But I'd also like for you to talk some about how you structured the book, because as we've said, there were 10 stories. But each of those chapters is also pointing us to a particular aspect of American slavery, a particular aspect of freedom generation, if you could talk a little bit about that term. So I know I've given you a lot there, but you can work with it however you want.
Right, so everybody can hear me too, right? You don't need this. Oh, I should need the microwave. I mean the microwave.
The microwave. That's funny.
It's different. So the first question was about these. So yes, so the white newspapers published, starting in sort of 1880s or so, white newspapers began publishing accounts in their newspapers of formerly enslaved people who just sort of happened to run into each other on the street, perhaps, or someplace else. And, after, a mother running into her child, or a husband running into a wife, and reuniting after 40 years of separation because they'd been sold away from each other. And it was all, and these articles were heavily racist articles intended for entertainment. They oftentimes they didn't even give the subjects last names. They would be Aunt somebody and Uncle somebody. So they were, they were clearly not about helping freed people find one another. They were written for a white audience, for the consumption of a white audience. And these appeared in all sorts of newspapers in the Midwest and, on the East Coast, everywhere. And at first we didn't know for sure whether we should even archive them at all because they didn't seem like they were real, but we decided we would, but we mark them and we say they're white newspapers. But these were clearly about covering up the reality of the history of slavery, right? These were published with a lost cause kind of audience in mind. And this, was intended to feed that kind of that desire to pretend or to act as if slavery was a thing of the past. It wasn't all, it wasn't all that bad because guess what? Everybody's always, all these freed people are finding one another again and living happily ever after. So it was really about a lie called the Lost Cause, in which white people by the 1880s were tired of thinking about what the war had been about and about emancipation, and wanted to just move on, and frankly weren't interested in civil rights or delivering on the promises of emancipation. And these stories certainly were part of that. They were clearly feeding that desire. But there's also, there are also actually sometimes probably real people behind some of these stories. So we did keep them in there. And I think it's kind of important in this particular moment to think about the work that those happy ending stories were doing, because they really were not about, telling truth about slavery. They were about telling a lie about slavery. And it was to try to cover up the stories that were being told in the black newspapers by Freedom Generation that, were about searches that were continuing and families that were still torn apart and living, and the repercussions of the violence that slavery did to slave families were still being lived in the 1880s and 1890s, and black people were telling them in their newspapers. And the white newspapers tried to sort of cover them up with these other stories of happy reunions. They weren't successful at doing it. And I kind of feel like we're at a similar moment now, where when we're not supposed to teach Black history anymore, and we're and the curriculum in schools are changing again, and federal funding is being pulled from projects that are trying to tell an authentic history of slavery. I think we're at a similar kind of a moment, a moment when you can sort of point and say white supremacy took a turn. Like there was a new, sort of a resurgence of it in the 1880s and the 90s. We're kind of there again, I feel like, with an attempt to erase this from everywhere. From university programs, teaching, all of that stuff. So.
I have to say that I had moments when I was reading the book that were actually really quite triggering. And I felt like I just had to put the book down often, because I felt like I'm living this. I was getting angry, and I would read and I would think about, what is happening, and lies that are being told, and cover-ups, and the ways that you want to change language, and I think in some ways you're answering one of the questions that I was thinking about, is the relevance of a book like this. Like, why this? Why now? Right? And that's partly. Maybe Bob, you could answer that, but I was maybe even you started working on this before the current moment. Yeah. But I felt like it's, in many ways, it's a perfect time for the book. It is officially launched, right?
Yes.
Like people can get it now. Yeah. And so maybe you would want to, either one of you would just talk about like why now, right? What's the relevance? The audience that's going to pick up this book, what are going to be the connections that they're going to make? And then I want to go back to the structure of the book one week.
I'll say for myself, nothing.
Yeah, you do. You do. They're saying that they.
All right, I'm sorry.
My mouth is way bigger than yours.
I'm not touching that one. It really drove home to, as I said, we're all aware that people were sold, families were broken apart and sold individually during the slavery era. But this book really drove home what that meant afterwards. The horror of it, it sounds awful, but it also sounds kind of cerebral. Oh yeah, that happened. That. But when you realize that people spent decades trying to find one another, the magnitude of harm, the pain of all of this, breaking up families, the barbarity of it, you really begin to understand it and feel it when you see just how hard people are trying to find one another, and the joy when they do. I remember those two sisters, that story, who found each other, and the joy, these elderly women, one of them running up to the other one, and the joy of however many decades that was, they were separated and finally they're together again. And as Judy was saying, I feel the same way. That the whole point of the white newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s was, slavery. That's all over. That's behind us. Forget about that. And we seem to be going through another. We know it's not over. How do you heal a pain like that? How do you compensate for that? These horrors that were done. And now we're not supposed to talk about it anymore. It's politically incorrect. It's whatever it is. In a sense, writing this book and maybe even reading this book is somewhat rebellious and saying, no, history is still with us. History still matters. It still shapes who we are, how we think, what we do. It isn't dead. yes, this story still speaks to people today. It should.
Thank you. Thank you. And amen to what you said. I'd love for you to talk about the chapters, right? And so one of the ways that I'd love for you to talk about them is perhaps to tell us what was perhaps the most difficult of the individual stories to write about, and maybe the most inspiring and most hopeful.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, sure. One thing that strikes me about the advertisements actually is the hopefulness in all of them. And as you read the advertisements that start every chapter, and if you go to the website, the incredible hope that people and the love that people express in these advertisements, they're very hopeful. And that really comes through in all of the chapters and all of the advertisements. So there's this amazing hope that seems to that endures for decades, and love. That said, there were some that were harder for me to work with than others. The ones that were the hardest for me were the ones dealing with children who were sold away. And so there's a chapter in there, I think it's 3 or 4, maybe 4, about a man named Henry Tibbs, who was sold away from his mother when he was a small child. And he then goes on to, he then goes on to live his whole life. He serves in the U.S. Colored Troops. He survives the Fort Pillow massacre. He is a survivor. And in his mid-50s, he takes out an advertisement looking for his mother, from whom he'd been sold. And he remembers her vividly. And in vivid prose, he describes the last time he saw her and how she tried to comfort him, and how, and just the awful moment that he was in, and the viciousness of the slave trader who was trying to trick his mother. And I can talk more about it, but it was the first chapter I wrote about a child looking for a mother. And we're all children, right? We all have parents, and it was really hard. It was a really hard chapter to write because it really made me think about a few things. Parents remembered. Parents looking for their children was really hard because they were holding on to details about a child who's very young, and that child grows up, and that child changes, and what does the child look like, and what are their names? But they had, they were old enough to sort of piece together memories that were useful. Like they had more names and places. When a child was separated from their mother very young, or father very young, their memories were vivid of that relationship, the feeling they had for their parent, but the information they had was much more was much less reliable, right? As you read these advertisements, you think, what is, they'll use 3 different names for their own last name. The place names are, it underscores how difficult it would have been for this child to find their parent. But also just, what we know about trauma and how it can affect the way you remember things. The traumatic moments, sometimes you remember parts of it vividly. Sometimes you don't remember it at all, right? And sort of the way that trauma works over the lifetime is really hard. And Henry Tibbs's chapter was the first one that I dealt with that. What it meant for a child to have lost their parent at a young age, and yet, be hopeful in his 50s that he would find her.
And you even write about in Henry's chapter about clear mistakes that he was making in terms of memory, right? Names that were wrong, but that you could, through your research, you could put it together and realize it's probably this name and it's probably this person.
Right.
But it is so important, I think, that when you talk about trauma, right, you're in very particularly in this chapter, you're talking about childhood trauma and the way that then impacts the rest of of his life.
Right. Yeah. Right. And that chapter 2, is where I was talking about sort of how common it was for children to be sold. Right. That that one of the lies that slaveholders said during slavery, was that that didn't happen, that children weren't separated from their parents, that they weren't sold away. There were laws in place in some places, in a lot of states, that prohibited the selling of children, yet it was done everywhere. It was very, very common for children to be sold. And we know that because people who survived the institution, when they wrote their memoirs, they talk about children being auctioned, they themselves or other children being auctioned. We know abolitionists illustrated their tracts with babies being auctioned. And visitors came from Europe and were shocked to see children being sold in the United States. And so we know this was common. And it was an essential part of the institution of slavery. Yet, again, there was no sort of central agency at the end of the Civil War that the Union government put together to help people find their family members. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that that people went free with all of these hopes that they would find people again. And so that was a tough one to sort of begin to think
I
about.
wondered also, you dedicated the book to Marisol, to your daughter, right? And I wondered if that was part of what you were experiencing as you were writing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's just unthinkable. And of course, and of course, as I was, when I first started writing the book, it underscores to me, we were, the official policy of the federal government was to separate children from their parents at the, U.S.-Mexico border. And not sort of keep track and not sort of acknowledge the fact that children who are separated from their parents are more likely to be trafficked. We know all of this stuff for decades of trying to fight the problem of trafficking, and yet that was happening when I started writing the book, so it brought home to me, the moment that we were in at that time, but also just that human feeling that you have for your own family and what it would mean to you to have a loss like that.
What was your favorite, right? Like the story that kind of, if there's a way to write that it brought you joy as you were writing?
Yeah, that's hard too. The students asked Bob that question in class. What was your favorite What was your favorite book you ever edited? And Bob said, "I can't choose. I won't choose, but I'll choose. I'll choose. All right, I'll choose a couple. I'll choose two. Well, one is Emmeline and Julia that you mentioned. These two sisters who find each other in Battle Creek, Michigan. So Emmeline runs away and she winds up in Battle Creek, Michigan. She goes on the Underground Railroad. She becomes part of it. I think trying to smuggle people to Canada, but she leaves her sister behind, and they find each other, and they wind up in Battle Creek, Michigan.
That's a movie, right?
I think so. It should be a movie. I think it's a great movie.
And I think you need to be like the consultant on set. Right. All right, I'm just saying. Go ahead.
It's a great story. Their story is really, really amazing. And then the other story is Diana Johnson's story, which is chapter 10. She was sold away from her family in Virginia, and she winds up in Texas, Goliad, Texas, which is a speck of a town on the border between Texas and Mexico. And she buys land. She buys a homestead of 260 acres of land, and she's a big landowner, and so which is beautiful because she leaves all these records. She's all over the courthouse. You have to go to Goliad to find her, but she's all over the courthouse buying and selling property. She was likely a rancher because that's what everybody did. She has a family there, a couple generations of family there, and she searches for her family back in Virginia in so many newspapers. She's writing. She must have written 15 ads in different newspapers.
Part of that's an indication that she has some money.
She does have money,
right?
And she has a daughter who's a teacher who likely helps her because she also does some unlikely things, like she writes to a newspaper. She writes to some newspapers in the North. She writes to a Polish language newspaper in Chicago looking for her family, which just blows me away. I don't understand how that happened. But she writes to towns like clerks who then publish her letter in newspapers. So her story is all over. Diana Johnson's story is all over the United States, popping up in different places. And when I went to Goliad, Texas, her property, when I went to the courthouse to check the property records, her property is still, because she's the original owner, it's still D. Johnson's property, even though it's not been in her family for years. But her story was really, to me, it was fascinating because she has this property, and there are black towns around there. Texas, there are a string of black towns. She's close to a black town, and she seemed to me to be, wanting to bring her family to her. It made sense if you have property, if we're talking about sort of inheritance, and we're talking about intergenerational wealth. Somebody like Diana Johnson had another imperative to find her family, which is to say, I have property. I would like that property to stay in my family, which is another part of the story that I think we should think about is, that finding your family was for you emotionally and for your immediate economic needs if you were getting older. But it was also about intergenerational wealth. Not being able to find your family prevented you from handing down property that you could, that you had made. Yeah.
I know that we're going to need to open this up for questions and answers. I also was thinking about the ways that these stories and the process of doing this work has expanded beyond the walls of the academy. And so you start, you're doing this archival work with your students and all of that. But, this work was, very early on, was centered in Mother Bethel and with church communities. And what has that experience been like bringing this work out into communities and real people, real neighborhoods?
Right.
What's that been like for you?
It's the best kind of work I've the great privilege of doing is working on projects that are meaningful beyond what's happening on beyond a college campus, college classroom, beyond. So, it's the joy of my professional career to get to do things that have use beyond what we do on college campuses. And I would say this project in particular has grown as genealogists have pointed us in directions. So this project, as I suggested, started very modestly, but we started meeting with genealogists everywhere, and they kept telling us what we should do, right? Like, no, don't stop in 1900. You need to look in 1910 and 1920 in the Chicago Defender.
Yes.
And at first, it caught our breath, and we're like, there's no way that can be possible. But they were right. And every time, genealogists pointed us in direction and said, you need to do, this is what you need to do. And we went there. And so the project grew because genealogists, kept pointing to new places and saying there was more there and we needed more. And also the website itself has grown with their needs in mind. So when you go to the website now, it's hopefully, more and more user-friendly all the time. Because when you're doing genealogy, you don't necessarily have all the information about your ancestors that you want. So you can't just have one way to search. We have 5 different ways to search. You can search by geography. You can search by enslaver. If you have a name of an enslaver, you can search by a map we have. And those were all, in response to genealogists who said to us, this is great, but what you really need is more of this, and we want this way. And genealogists are the transcribers. So every ad is an image, and volunteers, who 90% of them are genealogists, transcribe the advertisement, which makes it then keyword searchable. So they're not just sort of, the consumers, they're producing the art. They're producing the archive too.
Can you tell me, we talked briefly about your decision to make sure that all of this information remains, to the best of your ability, remains open access.
Yes. Yeah.
And can you talk about even the dilemma that you had about open access versus things behind paywall?
Oh, yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so everything that all the ads that we have are identified by reading microfilm, right? Maggie knows that from lots of microfilm. Graduates, that you sit right there and read microfilm on an old microfilm reader before we got new microfilm readers. And because we do that, because we're not using anything that you can get from newspapers.com. Newspapers.com doesn't have a lot of black newspapers anyway. Okay. So everything is open access because we have not used any, pay per access material. That makes it harder, but it ensures that it's free. Yes. Because from the very beginning, we didn't, this is sort of another way to monetize people's ancestors. And we wanted had nothing to do with the ancestry industrial complex. Although they've come to us, and genealogists will tell you they pay for Ancestry, they pay for newspapers.com, they pay for Fold3, Genealogy Bank. All of those things cost money, and they shouldn't, because it's your history, and so that's why we needed to secure funding for this too, because we needed to make sure it would remain free. Ancestry's come to us at least twice, offering to help us with this work and make it easier for us and give us money for it. But that would mean that it would live behind a paywall, because that's the way Ancestry is a for-profit company. And so we've always said no to that. And I stick by that decision. On the other hand, I am worried now with sort of this moment that we're in where data is just, when people are erasing stuff, that I feel like maybe the better thing to do was to make sure it was everywhere, everywhere all at once, so they can't, maybe they can erase it here, but they can't erase it, or, so it's not, by the way, we do backup things. We keep, we're hiding things under the mattresses to make sure that nothing is gonna disappear overnight. But yeah, the goal was to always make this stuff free.
I feel like I want to bring people into this conversation, and I want to give you all a chance to be able to ask questions. I still have lots of questions, but I suspect maybe some of my questions, some of you will ask them. So why don't we do that? I don't know if there are mics, if there's a mic anywhere, but I'm happy to walk back there with Mike.
I mean,
no, you can't walk. You can sit down. And let me take this microphone, and then you want the spare mic. If there are questions, here you go.
This isn't necessarily, great talk, great topic. You're giving these stumblebums who are in charge now too much credit. They aren't smart. They aren't organized. They really aren't committed to this. You see what Trump's doing with this tariff stuff. It's on, it's off, it's up, it's down. They aren't anywhere near as formidable an opponent as antebellum slave owners. They fundamentally ran the government. American presidents came from the South until the Civil War. Lots of politicians, lots of policymakers. These guys, they can't find their ass with both hands, really. Okay, so what you got to do is you have a chance to demonstrate, to oppose these people, do it. Show up. Okay? Okay? Yeah. And when it comes time to vote, vote. Please, young people, you gotta go and vote. That didn't happen this last time. And there was a cat's whisker of a result. A few more Swifties talking a great game until it's time to put up. Now we're going to do this, don't like that. Nobody showed up. You gotta show up.
Thank you. So tell me, what kinds of questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
How far into the current day did you have people currently living that you could interview them about their family, go the other direction?
Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
I did not go. I really reserved. This book is for Freedom Generation. So the generation of people who came free during the Civil War, who've searched for their families the rest of their life. So so I follow them as far as I can to tell their stories. I don't follow their descendants' stories. I hope now that the book is out in the world, that people who maybe recognize a name here will come and contact me, right? But, and then maybe we can do some of that work now. But I need descendants to contact me, before I can sort of find out where the story goes in the future. But this book was about Freedom Generation. Yeah.
One of the notes that I put in my, my marginal notes, I was like, this is such an ever-expanding project. And that's, it almost, it seems like it's just going to be something that you will work on for the rest of your life, right? I don't know if you were expecting to do that, but it just every chapter I was reading, it was like those kinds of questions. What's going to happen when somebody finds their people, right? We have another question.
Wonderful talk. Wonderful book. Hi. In looking at the project and then reading the book and then talking to you about it as well, it didn't strike me until I actually was reading the book the extent to which this process might actually have also been a form of resistance, even if it was not articulated as such. I wanted to get my family together, what have you, for reasons of love or passing on wealth. But that one of the things that slaveholders tried to do is to deny the slave family and to erase them as people. And so the act of reclaiming your family was a big part of what freedom meant. And reading these things that are just something you know, but the impact of reading these things was that even if not something that maybe some of the preachers who were reading these things in church were also saying, this is what we have to do because it's another way to say we're going to reclaim our history. I don't know that. But certainly the power of that collectively hit me, I'm sure it hit others, and probably people at the same time. But it relates as well, I think, to the question that came up here several times about relevance, and that is you must control your own story. And this is an attempt to control your own story and not have somebody else dictate it to you. So kudos to you again.
Thank you, Randall. Randall also heard about this, a lot of pieces of this book over the years, so thank you. I agree, and some of the advertisements, I'm going to shout now so people can hear me. Some of the advertisements actually are very overt about the way they're about their resistance. They'll, especially parents looking for their children, sometimes use put the terms of ownership in parentheses. Yes. So they would say owned by, and they would put them in not parentheses, in quotation marks. And as if anybody could own another person's child, and so they're articulating that the right to family in the way that they're deciding these terms of ownership. Clearly, that's impossible. Who can own somebody else? And so that resistance is definitely there, and I think that is the story too. I agree. Yeah.
Didn't that complicated the search too to some extent, because there were people who had one name in slavery and another name later on. Their names were changed by slave masters. Yep. And so sometimes you're looking for somebody and their name is different.
Oh yeah. And the ads will say their names were, my name was this, then my name was that, and right. So they're giving you a roadmap by telling you all the different enslavers whose names they might have had, but who changed their names. But yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the advertisements again are talking about people ran away, Emmeline, right, who ran away, and that's very overt. And there were some advertisements as early as the 1840s that talked about, and the 1850s that talked about the Underground Railroad. I escaped on the the term Underground Railroad doesn't appear until sort of ads in the 1870s, but people in the 1840s are talking about stations. I was at this station when I lost my husband, and they're in Canada, right? And so, where these advertisements are real-time, accounts of people who are resisting the institution by running away. Yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Tell us about a couple moments when you struck gold. Like, I live with a historian, and it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I found something. So share something when you found something and you just couldn't sleep that night.
Yeah. So I think this Emmeline story that she winds up in Battle Creek, it kind of haunted me for a while because the story that I read about it was in a white newspaper. So I didn't want to use it. I didn't want it to be a story because I knew it was a different kind of source, like I was saying earlier. But it was a really compelling story, and so I said, well, let me just at least check to see if maybe these are real people. And then I discovered a lot. I learned a lot about Emmeline and her sister Julia, and those were these moments when I thought, oh my God, she's a real this is a real person. And she did escape from Kentucky, and so that story turned out to be a real story. It was told in the newspaper in Battle Creek because they were sort of celebrating their abolitionist memory. You know, they were sort of saying this town was an abolitionist hotbed, and so here's a story about somebody who escaped. But then they really didn't do a whole lot with their story other than to say they found each other again. But it was an aha moment for me to discover that those were real people, and that there was plenty of evidence to suggest that her escape was real, and the fact that and that they had found each other not because just sort of accidentally finding one another in Battle Creek, Michigan, but they had been looking for each other. So that was an aha moment that I might have actually had in a lovely house in upstate New York somewhere when I was working on this book. So that was one of the aha moments. That was, thanks for that question.
Can I get that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll come to you.
So I heard you say at the start of your talk that there were 300 newspapers and approximately 4,500 advertisements. So is that, part one of my question, is that expanding? Are you still trying to collect more? And then the second part is, if people are interested in transcribing, how can one do that and not be a part of the Villanova University?
Oh, yeah, anybody can transcribe. And you don't even have to read handwriting, which is amazing. I have a lot of undergrads now who can't read handwriting. And graduate students too. I think it's just not a thing that people are taught anymore. So your question was, there are 4,500, and is it still growing?
Yeah, are you still looking and trying?
We have funding until the end of August. As long as we have funding, we will continue to look. We have a couple of real go-getters. Veronica, she's sitting right in front of you. She's ready to answer her question. I don't know where Alex is. Is Alex? Oh, there she is. Right there. There she is. I couldn't see them until just now, until they raised their hands. And they are committed to getting to 5,000 ads.
We're so close.
We're so close. So close. So if we get to 5,000, it's because of these two right here and the work that they're doing, because they are on top of it. When I said to them, we need to be prepared for the federal funding to end, Alex's quote was like, "We're going to show those jerks. We're going to get to 5,000, right now, and we'll show them." And that was lovely. So if it happens, you're looking at the reason why right there. And then your second question was, anybody can transcribe. Right now, our transcription mechanism, I don't want to bore you with the tech details, but it started breaking because the project grew, and then our updating our software, which is called Omeka, wasn't playing nice with the software that we use to open the transcription up to anybody. So it started to break, and so we've stopped it right now. So there isn't any right now. The federal funding we were hoping to get starting in September was going to allow us to hire somebody to fix it. So it's currently on pause. We hope, I don't know what's going to happen after August.
Thank you.
But hopefully maybe someday we'll.
Or maybe someone is familiar with the software and
we'll restart it or something. Yeah, we'll restart it. It's complicated. It's like layers of secure. Anyway, but thank you. Yes, stay tuned.
Can I ask a question before we go on to the next questions from the audience? If somebody were so moved by the book and by the conversation that they wanted to help the project, which is about to lose some funding, how would they do that?
Thank you for that question.
That was unrehearsed.
So you can donate to the project. We have a donate button, which is not working right now, which we need to work on that, because it goes through because you're donating to Villanova, which is a nonprofit. I need to get in, and I need to figure out how to fix our capacity to receive donations online. There's another way. I don't know. How does one donate? Adele, how does one donate? Help me. I don't know.
Thank you for that question. Here's what you do. You go to villanova.edu, give, and then you can designate your gift. You don't need to go through Julie's
You don't have to go through
site.
the, okay, that's good.
Just make sure that you
right now.
designate to Last Seen Project, and I can guarantee you that it will get to the project. But there's a very, very long list, thousands of things you can donate to. So just make sure you specify Last Seen Project, and it will get them. Or you can email me. And I promise I will keep the money. Make sure it gets to the press.
Thank you, I'm glad.
You got another question here.
Oh, yeah, hi, Veronica.
Hi. Long time no see.
Hi.
So, like, through the process of reading the book and also working on the project, something that really struck me is, like, the power of these freed people going out there in the world and kind of asserting themselves and basically becoming their own record keepers. Something we talked a lot about in our Reconstruction class is kind of the issues that freed people experience after emancipation, where they don't have birth certificates, they don't have marriage records, they don't have any of that, and so they're kind of starting from this like clean slate of like nothingness, and that causes a lot of problems with like pensions and everything.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of wondering, can you talk a bit about that, about how these like black newspapers and these ads are really like a new way of record keeping, even if it's more of an informalized way of doing it.
Oh, that's such a smart question. You should come to our MA program. So smart.
Crazy. I'll think about it.
They can fund you. Yeah. You could. The button on the website for that might not be working, but we'll get it. That's such a smart way to think of these. I mean, it is. You know, they're almost like oral history. I mean, they're almost like an oral history. Sometimes they're even written in third person, right? You know, so it is in some ways, they're kind of like, they kind of do the same work as Federal Writers Project interviews do, right? Where people sat down and with somebody who was writing. Sometimes it was a pastor, sometimes they were doing it themselves, and they are making a record of their lives, and so they are. It is a form of record keeping, and in a way, kind of like even obituaries sometimes did that, do that kind of work too. And people don't have a lot of records, that their family will sit down and say, well, let me tell you about this, let me write to the paper and tell that family's story. So I think that's, I hadn't thought of it that way, and I think that's really, I wish you would have said that to me when I was writing.
Sorry. I think that started before I showed up, so.
Yeah, it did start before you showed up, but I think that is, it is definitely kind of vernacular, record keeping, right? And and the way they trace the names, and the way they're like talking about their names and their service, and as best they can remember their birth dates, which they don't always know. I think that's great. I don't know if I answered your question, but other than to say that was a great question, and I think it's exactly the right thing to think, a way to think about. Yeah.
So I hope this isn't too recherche, but then can you talk a little bit about this source base in comparison to the WPA source base?
Sure. So if people are not familiar with the Works Progress Association, during as part of the New Deal, hired out of work writers to to survey, to speak with and interview freed people who were still alive, and so they went to they traveled the South. Each one of these sort of is organized by state, and they identified freed people and they interviewed them about slavery, what they remembered about slavery, and so these were elderly people who were mostly being interviewed by mostly white interviewers. And they were directed by people who were sort of folklorists. So they were interested in kind of, what kinds of foods did you eat, and what kinds of music, what kinds of songs did you sing, and they were also deeply, their own memory or their own sort of understanding of slavery was deeply shaped by the lost cause. So they were asking loaded questions, and sometimes they did. And of course, freed people who were poor, were raised to speak to white people in a certain way and not to, not to say other things and not to reveal things, to keep things sort of safe. So the Federal Writers Project interviews with former slaves are amazing, and they're such important sources. And I think there's like 2,700 of them, and they're one-of-a-kind sources and really, really extraordinary snapshots of these people's lives at this, late in their lives. And most of these people were children when they were enslaved because they're still alive in the 1930s. Their limitations are the ones I just described, which is that that they have, a lot of them have white interlocutors. They're shaped by the decades of that they've lived since then and the poverty. And some people thought that it was the federal government and that they thought we're going to get benefits from this, so they didn't want to say anything that would And so these advertisements don't have those white interlocutors. If they do have interlocutors, there are likely black pastors, who are signing on to these ads. So it makes it a little different. And the context is different. But one of the things that we've always wanted to do, because we can do this now, is to, I use the Federal Writers Project in this book, their interviews to sort of sketch out people's lives in places where I found them. What we've always wanted to do is compare the names. Scrape the names from our database, scrape the names from the Federal Writers Project to see if we have some of the same people in them. So that's a great question, Rebecca.
Do we have another question? Yes.
It is 5:15.
All right. I'm going to make yours the last question, if that's okay.
I just wondered about the methods you used, the historical methods that you'd use to research past the ad. If it's so hard to find people or find names, what can you look at?
Yeah. If the advertisements name enslavers, they're easy to find in the records. They're all over the records. So they're in the census, they're in the slave schedules, and that's certainly helpful if they name enslavers. Not all of them do, but some of them will say I was owned by, and they'll name. Oh, actually, a lot of them do. A lot of them do. If I'm being accurate here, a lot of people do, because they saw them as owned by, right? Because those names were stable, and I think people recognize that in the ads because they're always naming enslavers. Not always, but most of the time they're naming enslavers. So that's helpful because those names are easy to find in the records. That doesn't mean I'm going to find, there's limitations to what I can find. I can find a likely slave owner. I can find a likely candidate for this family. But the records are, slave schedules just sort of have hash marks. So, this slave owner owned, 10 women between the ages of 10 and 20. And that's all I have, right? Sort of hash marks by age and gender. So it's hard to find, it's hard to identify as specifically who I'm seeing in the advertisement. Backward. Forward, of course, after 1870, freed people are enumerated in the census as people. Before 1870, they're not. So I can find, I can find them in the census. I can find them in, Freedmen's Bureau records if they're seeking aid. I can find them in military records if they're enlisting, and everything in between. So if they're applying for a pension, if they're a wife, a widow applying for a pension, I find them in the pension applications. Yeah.
Judy, it was even harder though than you were saying, because some of the spellings of the owners' names were phonetic, and not actually the spellings of the names.
Yeah.
So not only did you had to figure out, okay, this person doesn't exist, so who might this person actually be?
Yeah.
Right. So it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Yeah. Henry Tibbs was talking about this slave jail. This is this small child, one of the children. He was talking about this jail, and he kept talking about this guy Bruthing, right? And it was in Virginia, and I knew where it was, and I knew that there were these big slave traders, and they have ads in the newspaper selling enslaved people, and I knew this guy was Bruin, but he says Bruthing in his advertisement. He says I was sold by Bruthing, and he names the city, and I know the city, and you know, and I know the slave gel that he's talking about because I've seen these ads. So there's sometimes it's, you know, sometimes I'm fortunate that I know enough about that place that I can figure that out. Other times I have to do a lot more digging and a lot more, trying to figure it out. Yeah.
We have a reception. Also, Judy's book is for sale here, and she is willing to sign. One thing that I just want to say is thank you for the work. Thank you to both of you for the work. Judy is a consummate teacher, and so as you are reading, she's going to take you to class. And it's a real privilege. It's accessibly written, and I sort of made reference to this as I was asking you questions, but each of these people are representative also of major moments and questions in the slave history. And so you're going to walk away with so much information. The other thing I wanted to say is thank you for the transparency. Because as she says, the enslavers' names there's no protecting people. And I think that's really important, right? That these names, these family names are, so not only are you getting the names of the individuals who are looking for their families, but you also are getting the names of the villains. And I think that that's really, it's really critical. It's really crucial. So will you all join me in thanking